This is Professor Escobar, and I just wanted to give you a quick um, overview of the week and dive into the lesson a little bit. So, thanks everyone for tuning in today, and I hope the semester is going well for you all. And yeah, I just love teaching this course, so it's really cool to dive into poetry once again. All right, so on the screen, you'll see our weekly modules. Here are the poets that we're reading for this week. Next week, we'll start reading Robert Haas's Summer Snow. So make sure that you have it, please. Um, More about those poets in a little bit. But let's go ahead and start on the lesson, and then I'll kind of talk about the reading for the week. So last week we talked about some of the fundamentals of poetry. This week we're going to talk about like a different set of fundamentals. Whereas last week you could really point to parts of the poem that you can flag as leaps or as that musicality, things that those the things we talked about last week were really tangible, like really, like they poked out of the poem a little bit, like you could tell, like it was obvious. This week, it's a little bit more abstract. It's a little bit more conceptual, and it might take a little second to kind of wrap your head around these things. But as we look at examples, you'll see them everywhere once you get the hang of it. All right, so the first concept of the week that I want to talk about is metaphor. So metaphor is when and these concepts are kind of easy to explain at first. Like the explanations are very simple. So you all know what metaphor is. It's in middle school I learned it as like a simile. There's simile or there's metaphor. A simile uses like whereas. That's kind of silly. We don't really talk about in poetry. We don't really talk about that too much. Uh, and we what we talk about more is anything that is non-literal meaning, and you're using one thing to talk about a language, it, to talk about another thing, that's a metaphor. So if I, was not feeling well and I described the weather at length, and that would be a metaphor, for my illness. As we find, metaphors are really powerful because they allow us to have like complex understandings without like defining or coming to a conclusion that might be limiting, or in a way that rational thinking or strictly logical thinking might deduce. So metaphors allow us to think of a world in an expansive, complex way, and invite the reader's imagination. So metaphors could be really profound. Like when Basho, for me, he this 16 in the 1600s, this Japanese poet wrote, "Silence is the rock absorbing cicada sounds." So, classic metaphor of saying this is what silence is, and then it equals this, and it equals a rock, like at night or in the daytime, just being fluctuated, or receiving an influx of input of cicada sounds. So for me, this was a really like life changing moment when I read this poem as an undergrad, because it totally changed my mind about silence. I grew up in the Inland Empire and was often surrounded by the silence of crickets at night, and I felt just like a deeply connected to that. And then at the same time, I was blown away by the power of metaphor, of like the power of poetry to totally change my worldview, uh, in such a beautiful, generous way, all by offering a simple metaphor, some words, some. So I thought that was really cool. Metaphors can also really be fun, be really funny, like when Cardi B says, macaroni in the pot in her song WAP, which we all know what it stands for. So like they can kind of be absurd but really funny. Like it's like macaroni in a pot. She's talking about her love, and it's really funny. I think it's really funny, and it doesn't even really make sense. It's just silly, but the metaphor still sticks. All right, and then in the lesson itself, I kind of talk about some like other examples of metaphor, and I'll let you kind of read those on your own. So some and so some of them are very quick, and then you can actually write a whole poem using like figurative language, and I include that poem in there. Another concept that we're talking about this week is image. So images ask us to imagine things, and so poems ask us to imagine things. And an image is like a little one of the things that a poem asks us to imagine. So if we think about uh, if we think about like any song that we love, it's going to have a number of images. And this is just better explained with an example. Uh, so this one comes from John Summit and Hyla. They have a really cool song together that many of you probably know. So this one is Do you dream alone under the moon? Is it brighter, brighter when I'm with you? So uh, it's a very simple image and one that we've encountered before, right? Romance under a moonlit sky, a night sky. We've seen this image 1,000 times in a million different settings. Um, but it's really profound here in this song, particularly. But the image is of people being under the moon. It's at the lyrics are asking us to imagine people under the moon longing for one another. So even though it's very simple, it paints that picture in our minds. So that's what an image is. Is so for this exercise, actually, this recording, this Zoom class, I want you to actually go through um, one of your favorite songs and highlight all the images that are in it. And then in another color, I want you to highlight all the metaphors. And you'll see that a lot of songs will have metaphors. Maybe it's just one or two. Even if you just think of Cowboy Carter, there's lots of metaphors in that um, song. So images are different from metaphors. It's like, as you can see, like an image is just something that the poem is actually asking us to visualize, whereas a metaphor is symbolic. A metaphor is symbolic. Um, all right, so the third concept that we're going to get into today is sound. So sound is just the idea that like poems are material things, like paintings or sculptures, and the material of poetry is sound, which is can be identified in syllables. The syllabic part of a word and its noise is actually a physical thing that we can measure, that is tangible. Sound waves, just like pigment, is tangible. Color is tangible. For our poetry, it's sound. That's our artistic medium. Um, and so the examples here kind of highlight kind of the beauty of having certain rhythms and sounds in a poem and how that can create meaning. That could be one of one of the ways sorry, one of the ways that we create meaning in the poem. So like if we look at Tanya Forrester's A Swarm of Bees in High Court, this excerpt, which is supposed to be a biography of Harlem, kind of she's putting together this book of poetry that's supposed to be like a biography of Harlem starting from the Atlantic um, era of early American days and going up to contemporary urban industrialized, post-industrialized Harlem. All right. So, be low, be lack, be rich and grudge, and be longing, be sodded, be ramble and hold. Be calm and go, be rim and ram the ball into the basket. Be ram in the bush important, be stung, be ache, be ring, be reft, and reach over. So she's using that B sound, as she's juxtaposing it to different sounds and she's repeating it. And those sounds are contrasting with one another. So you can see how at the syllable level of the syllable, you know, this B being one syllable and a word like important having three syllables, the level of the syllable is kind of like the unit she's using, and she's using that to kind of paint an emotional kind of atmosphere and experience for us. So that's what sound is. It's like when you use poetry's, the physical quality of poetry to create meaning and explore ideas and stuff like that, and create feelings. So I'll leave you with more examples here and that you can read on your own. All right. So next we have, and lastly we have breath. So breath is probably like an intermediate concept. If all of these other concepts are kind of elementary and basic, this is like, middle school. Intermediate, this is a pretty difficult concept at first to wrap your head around. Maybe, maybe. So think of I for let's start with just like a thought experiment. So if you press your face close to glass and then you blow on it, you know how it creates that kind of organic, ephemeral shape, and it kind of dissipates after a couple seconds. And if you were to do that again on a different spot of the mirror, it would look a little different, right? And depending on the glass or the time of day or the how hard you're breathing, it would always look different. Every breath that we take on this earth is actually different, you know, physiologically, you know, than one another. They're very similar, but no two breaths are the same. And if we had like a kind of visualization of like oxygen and carbon dioxide, you would see like these clouds kind of forming out of each one of us. Breath. Breath. Um, so this idea of what breath is really creates a revolution in poetry in the middle of the 20th century. After the world is broken by war, people are like, I don't want to write a villanelle about the sky. I don't want to write a ballad about the grass and flowers. I don't want to write a sonnet about the sunset. We don't, as poets, we don't want to write these received metrical forms. We want something that's more freeing. Instead, we feel like we don't want to have a template that we write poetry into. We should be able to write however we want, whenever we want. Um, so this idea is called free verse, and it's one we're all familiar with. But the concept is that like just as the human breath is extraneous and organic and ephemeral, our poetry can look like that too. It doesn't have to look like, these like cereal boxes, you know, of text. We're not writing church hymns for churches anymore. We're not writing songs of worship of God, you know. So we don't have to write in those biblical forms. So obviously people love this. It's a very popular idea. And that's kind of why poetry looks like this today. If we look at Ted Berrigan's Things to Do in New York City. And uh, the idea with breath is that you don't have to write in certain meters, so you don't have to organize your syllables to be stressed and unstressed, hexameters, pentameters, those kinds of things. You your the shape of your poem can change by line, and it could be determined by what you want to talk about. So the subject can determine the form of the poet of the poem. So that's why modern poetry today looks like this, where it's like the breath against the glass. All right. So I'll leave you to read Ted Berrigan's poem, uh, "Things to Do in New York City." I hope you enjoy it. But so some of the things to note about free verse, and that's why we're having this assignment this week. Is I want you to note the spacing. I want you to note the variation between stanzas, how the stanzas look different from one another. I want you to note the rhythms, to observe the rhythms of the poem that are created by line length and repetition. I want you to note the unevenness of certain lines, and I want you to note and observe the use of punctuation. So when you can play with all these variables, that's like free verse. It's like everything, all the components of grammar and language and syntax are at your disposal. Um, do what you will. Let let what's you feel on the inside influence your canvas, influence your poem. All right. So that's this week's lesson. I kind of ran through these, kind of going at like a TikToker's pace. So I hope some of the ideas landed. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this week's reading. So I kind of just want to kind of go through the different poets and poems that we're reading and kind of talk about some of the ideas behind them and how what we learned, in this lesson plays out in these poems. And I'll just give you a couple notes for each poem to help you through it. So this is very much a free verse poem. So you can see like poets today are not really writing in like hexameters or strict sonnets or with stressed and unstressed syllable structures. They are letting the subject of their poem guide the form of the poem, how the poem looks. Um, and then, of course, we get this image. We entered with 40 million warriors. 40 million warriors is, I would highlight this in my homework. And this is one of the images of this poem. And I really like Anna because the I feel like of a lot of the poets that I know, she really is able to write with like language, but then there's also like the content of the poem and like the turns and emotional kind of experience of it. And those are both really vivid and lucid and clear for her as a poet. I'll talk more about her in the future. She's really cool. So Noor Hindi, our amazing Palestinian poet and journalist, talks. You could see in free verse about these things, about the media environment, voicelessness and disinformation, and how it's harmful, and destructive. Um, all right. And this is kind of like, we'll talk more about this in coming weeks, but like kind of bearing witness to his history and documenting history and the injustices and horrible things and realities of certain people. So we'll talk more about that. Poetry as bearing witness in the coming weeks. Ansel Berrigan, another free verse poet. Oops. So this is really so. What's really cool is there's lots of images in this poem. So thinking of non-intervention with you, a red sun, don't look, pokes through, staging development and cutting loose of its facile integrity is disproportionate personal nonsense. The wince, the shrug. So here we have some images: a red sun, someone wincing, shrugging. The images can look very different, but if we were going to take Polaroids of each part of this poem, of each image, we would have an image of red sun. We would have an image of someone wincing and an image of someone shrugging. So Anselm is really cool because he has all these leaps and all these images, and he uses a lot of sound to kind of create kind of like this non-linear experience of reading and listening to poetry. I always find it really cool. Nicole Seeley, another. This is a really amazing poem with and you look at the for sounds. I kind of gave you three guidelines for how to think about sound, how to play with sound is juxtaposition, repetition, and contrast. And so she has a whole poem where every line contains the letters together and so it really creates kind of this really rich, interesting, complex poem, a sonic experience, which has all kinds of interesting meanings and half meanings, and it's very imaginative. So this is the poem, and I'll just read like a couple stanzas. Withstand pandemonium and scandalous nightstand, commanding candlelight, and quicksand and Zinfandel, clandestine line mines, candy handfuls, and contraband, and handmade commandments. So you can have a lot of fun with sound and have that actually be like the driving force of your poem. And we'll look at kind of like one example of that really quickly. We'll jump to the very end where this is really amazing poet M. Norbese Philip. Um, so she had a whole book length project on this slave ship, this ship of enslaved peoples during the transatlantic slave trade that was destroyed. People were slaughtered on the ship, the enslaved people, so that the slave traders could collect insurance. So she wanted to honor and dignify and explore all that, but all that survives are legal records where black people are property and not really talked about in humane terms by any measure. And so she uses sound to kind of explore and the depths of the tragedy and of their lives and of the experience. So there's the whole book length poem, and you could even see kind of like how just scrolling through the poem, the sound and the free verse allows her to kind of explore these things in depth um, with such limited, you know, resources. There's actually like an abundance, she's able to create. So I'll let you look at that and read that aloud. That'll be an experience of it in and of itself. So John Yao has these couplets. I think he's a great poem for. This is a love poem that I threw in for this week, being that it's Valentine's Day or Single Awareness Day. I remember being an undergrad and I went to a chocolate shop and I bought a hot chocolate for myself to feel better. And everyone in line is in a couple and I'm by myself. And then I go to order the hot chocolate and they're like, "Do you want two?" And like smiling, like happy. And I'm like, "No, just one." And they're like, "Oh." And yeah, it wasn't anything mean or anything. It was just like, oh my God, Singles Awareness Day. So that's poem is in here for that reason. City Without a Name. So I like this is a really important poet, winner of the Nobel Prize. So this is a very long poem, but tons of images in here, written in more of a verse, but even free verse and how the stanzas are changed and uneven. and kind of like a hybrid between like older styles, European styles, and contemporary poetics. So, pretty cool poet. I hope you enjoy it. Um, all right. So this poem is another poem where bearing witness to history and a poem that uses images. All poems use images, but I want you to see kind of like how like a queer artist does that, or an artist that is working in multiple languages. How they create and talk about contemporary issues with poetry. All right, Cecilia Vicuña, very lucid images, very emotional, very sonic. Her poems are very sound based, but then she also has very lucid images where she things that we can imagine. And whenever she's in poetry magazine, she's always on the cover. She's really really cool. And then lastly, another sound driven poet, very very sonic. Think like just like I think like jazz and social music, as it was once called. Whenever I think about him, so Yusuf Kuminyaka, blues chant hoodoo revival. My story is how deep the heart runs to hide and laugh with your hands over your blank mouth, your face behind the mask, talking in tongues, something tearing feathers from a crow that screams from the furnace, the black candle in the skull, sweet pain of meat. All right, so that's just Yusuf Kuminyaka, and like sonic, very sonically driven. Um, and so there's all sorts of ways to create those sounds, but I think he's a really good person to study. So I'm excited to see what observations that you have about him. All right, and that's this week pretty much. I guess we could look at the assignments to get some of the assignments together. Um, so these three assignments are review from last week. As you can imagine, we're going to have review on these assignments next week. Um, Read the poems, make observations, share your observations with the class, and then compose stanzas in free verse. So I'm excited to see what you all write for these. So have fun. We looked at kind of all kinds of ways to create free verse. So you're creating poems that are based in images and made up of images. You're asking us to imagine different things, that you play with sound, and you do that through spacing, punctuation, repetition, juxtaposition, contrast. You use metaphors, so you could give us really delicious kind of comparisons and metonymy and symbols to think about life. And then lastly, breath. The idea that these stanzas can be look however they need to, that you can organize your lines however you need to, and that's control. That the form of poetry is influenced by the subject what you're writing about. So those are all modern, contemporary fundamentals, and that's actually those are the 8 fundamentals from this week and last week that I think I could cobble together for an exciting poetry class. I think that's everything you kind of need to know about create modern poetry, contemporary poetry. So I'm excited to see what you all write, and of course, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. And I'm just excited to see what you write, and let me know if this is making sense and if you're enjoying it, and if it's all good. I'm excited to see what poems that you write.